He had less than 100 kilometers to live before his tanks ran dry. The altimeter was spinning wildly toward zero, but what he saw through the smoke would change aviation history forever. December 17, 1944, 8 a.m. A narrow, snow-choked dirt road near Hansfeld, Belgium. The air itself was a weapon. It sliced through the thick, gray greatcoats and bit deep into the bones of every man in the column. Joachim Peiper, commander of the lead combat group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, did not feel the cold. He felt the drag, the grinding, agonizing slowness of his entire armored spearhead as it chewed through the unforgiving Ardennes forest. From the cupola of his command half-track, he could see the tanks, massive, intimidating, yet inert. The pride of the 6th Panzer Army, the King Tigers, 70 tons of steel and lethal potential, were lumbering beasts, each one drinking fuel with an unquenchable, terrifying thirst. Peiper's eyes were not fixed on the map or the American positions ahead. They were fixed on the supply wagons, or rather, the lack of them. This was the Führer's last gamble. Operation Whack 'em Rhine, or Watch on the Rhine. A desperate, lightning-fast thrust to split the Allied lines, seize the key port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. But a panzer division runs on petrol, not ambition, and they had almost none. The official briefing had been clear: push fast, bypass resistance, and live off the enemy's stores. Capture American fuel dumps. It was a strategy born of desperation, a military mandate that rested entirely on improvisation. Peiper's radio crackled with reports. Forward scouting elements were already scraping the bottom of their jerry cans. The column was moving, but the engine notes were strained, the pauses between advances becoming longer. The men, their faces masked by frozen scarves and the exhaustion of perpetual motion, knew the brutal truth. If the tanks ran dry, they would instantly become immobile steel tombs in a freezing white hell. "The tanks need feeding, Colonel," reported his chief of staff, his breath misting into the frozen sky. "We've burned through the reserves getting this far. An hour, perhaps two, before the lead company is dead in the snow. They will not even have the energy to retreat." Peiper did not reply with tactics. He replied with cold, hard necessity. "Tell them to push harder, to smell the gasoline. The main supply lines are too far behind. We find the American reserves, or this entire offensive collapses before it reaches the Meuse River." His orders cut through the despair. They had broken through the thin American line. A startling, unexpected success. Now, they had to capitalize on that breach. The map indicated a major Allied logistical hub just miles away, tucked safely behind what the Americans thought were secure lines. It was a colossal gamble. They were running headlong into the enemy's logistical heart with engines running on vapor. He watched a Panzer IV struggle up an icy incline, its tracks fighting for purchase, its engine screaming under the strain. Every gallon it consumed was a gallon they might not replace. Victory did not depend on courage or superior German steel. It depended entirely on a simple commodity America seemed to possess in terrifyingly limitless supply. Where is the fire? Peiper thought. Where is the fuel? Then, through the pines, a scout car tore back toward the main column, kicking up thick plumes of snow. The driver was practically shouting through the freezing air, his face pale with adrenaline and excitement. He pointed east with a shaking hand. "Colonel, Stavelot, the Americans, they're packing up. There's a staging area and the smell, sir. I swear I can smell the gasoline from here. It's a mountain of it." Peiper's blood surged through the cold. It was not just a staging area. It was the jackpot, the entire reason for his existence at this moment. He slammed his fist on the hatch. The column surged forward, the low rumble of German engines now carrying a desperate, hungry note. They were no longer fighting for the fatherland. They were fighting for the very lifeblood of their machines. But what would they find when they finally crashed through the last line of defense? Would it be enough to feed the monster he had unleashed? The roar of the engines became a shriek. The tanks, now running on fumes and pure adrenaline, smashed through the outer perimeter of the village of Stavelot. The initial American resistance was sharp, brief, and brutally overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of the German assault. SS Grenadiers leaped from their half-tracks, clearing buildings house by house, their breath pluming into the icy dawn. Peiper did not stop for the house-to-house fighting. His attention was fixed on the sound of distant, muffled explosions, and the telltale scent of burning petroleum now heavy on the wind. The Americans knew exactly what he was after. They were trying to burn the golden ticket before he could reach it. His column, a snaking line of steel and men, burst through the final line of houses and onto a vast, flat open area outside the town. The sight was intoxicating in its promise, and horrifying in its scale. In one direction, a massive black plume of oily smoke twisted violently toward the sky, a towering column of industrial death. It was a funeral pyre of barrels, drums, and jerrycans, the crackling sound of the inferno drowning out the distant gunfire. The American engineers, anticipating his arrival, had lit a monstrous bonfire, sacrificing millions of gallons of precious fuel to deny the Germans. You can almost feel the heat from that conflagration, even decades later, a testament to the scorched earth desperation of the defense. But next to the raging fire, miraculously untouched by the flames, was the critical reserve, a field stretching hundreds of yards, stacked impossibly high with what looked like an entire ocean of olive-drab drums. They were stacked in geometric pyramids, neat, endless rows stretching back until they blurred into the gray horizon. The sight was paralyzing in its sheer, unbelievable scale. It was a testament to a level of industrial output that defied everything Peiper had witnessed in 4 years of grinding, continental war. Peiper dismounted from his command vehicle. The air here was thick with the rich, unmistakable smell of high-octane gasoline and burned rubber. His men, a mixture of hardened veterans and young, frozen replacements, stood staring. They were not looking at the enemy or the blazing inferno, they were looking at their salvation. "A company," Peiper barked, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Secure the perimeter. The rest of you start transferring. Now, every man. We have 50,000 gallons to load, and the Americans will be back for it before the hour is out." The men scrambled. They broke open the stacks, their frozen fingers fumbling with the heavy drums. The rhythmic clank of steel on steel, the splash of fuel, the hiss of siphons. It was the sweetest, most vital music they had heard since the offensive began. This was more fuel than the entire Kampfgruppe had been allocated for the entire operation. It was enough to drive his tanks not just to the Meuse, but perhaps all the way to Antwerp itself. It was the lifeblood of the last great German offensive. Peiper walked slowly through the maze of metal drums. He ran a gloved hand over the cold, slick surface of a barrel. The metal was not the thin, often recycled German steel. It was thick, robust, stamped with clear, crisp English lettering. He knelt examining the stenciling on a freshly opened drum. The letters were stark, bold, and inescapable. 50-gallon, gasoline, United States Army, made in America. The simple words were a direct punch to the gut. They were not fighting against a tired, overextended opponent. They were fighting an industrial continent. He stood up, his triumph instantly poisoned. He had seized a victory, a necessary, life-saving victory. But as he looked out across the seemingly endless, silent rows of American fuel, a terrifying, cold realization began to dawn. This was not just a fuel dump. This was a single, insignificant drop from a bottomless bucket. How could a nation, blockaded and bombed, possibly match this production? The fuel was theirs for now, but the war, he suddenly understood, was not. Peiper stood in the middle of the captured field, the chaos of his men working furiously around him a distant hum. The sheer volume of the reserve was overwhelming, and it did not just represent fuel. It represented the cold, relentless mathematics of modern war. His entire thrust, the most vital spearhead of the Wehrmacht's last great offensive, had been stalled for 12 precious, irreplaceable hours because of logistics. 12 hours that had bought the Americans time to organize their defenses, to reinforce the crucial Meuse bridges, and to prepare the counterattack that was surely closing in on him. And yet here, in this single captured location, was the evidence of the Allied side's effortless, staggering abundance. In Germany, every single liter of benzene was fought for, hoarded, and carefully rationed. The fuel that propelled his own Tiger tanks was often a lower-quality synthetic, manufactured in distant, vulnerable plants that were constantly under Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force bomber attack. Every tank movement was predicated on a calculation of maximum efficiency versus operational reach, a constant fear of being stranded. He watched his men, who were now siphoning the rich, high-octane gasoline with reckless enthusiasm. They were not just filling their main tanks, They were filling every empty vessel they could find. Helmets, cooking pots, whatever could hold the precious liquid. For them, this fuel meant life, movement, and the chance to keep fighting. For Peiper, it was a ledger entry of national doom. He looked toward the immense, smoking black plume. Millions of gallons had been intentionally set alight by a handful of retreating American engineers. Millions of gallons treated as utterly expendable. What kind of industrial power could afford to burn its most essential commodity simply to deny it to the enemy? It was the gesture of a power that did not feel the pinch, that could simply reorder a replacement shipment and have it steaming across the Atlantic within weeks. Peiper recalled the pre-war briefings. He remembered the maps showing the vast, untouched American industrial heartland, the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, the refineries of the East Coast. He had always dismissed them as clever propaganda, as the exaggerated boasting of a materialistic republic. Now, standing on Belgian soil, surrounded by the physical manifestation of that power, he saw the lie in his own previous belief. We have the will, the propaganda had always claimed. We have the superior Aryan soldier. But the superior soldier, Peiper realized with a chilling clarity that had nothing to do with the Ardennes frost, was useless without the means to move him. War was not a contest of spirit, it was a contest of tonnage. Of steel, of rubber, and most critically, of refined crude oil. He thought of his Fuhrer, locked away in his concrete bunker, obsessing over minute tactical movements on a map while the true battle was being lost in the factories, the shipyards, and the endless oil fields thousands of miles away. Germany's entire economy was choking to death, fueled by desperation and a dwindling synthetic supply that was constantly under attack. He had captured 50,000 gallons of gasoline, a miraculous, life-saving bounty. Yet the supply chain that produced this single dump was already moving the next 50,000 gallons, and the 50,000 gallons after that, across the ocean and into the heart of Europe. His victory here was a pittance, a single cup of water drawn from a geological tidal wave. We cannot win this war. The thought was treasonous, crushing, yet undeniable. It settled over him with a weight heavier than the armor of his own king tigers. The realization was not about fear of death. It was the profound psychological terror of fighting a ghost, an enemy whose logistics were fundamentally more terrifying than any tank division. "Colonel, we are topped off. We are ready to move." The shout from a sergeant brought him back to the frozen reality of the moment. The men were elated. Their tanks were full. They had won the logistical fight. But the delay had cost them dearly, and the enemy was now stirring, closing the net on the spearhead they had pushed so recklessly forward. Peiper turned, the stench of American fuel filling his lungs. It was time to use this fleeting resource, to drive forward until it ran out. But this time, he was not driving toward victory. He was driving toward an inevitable, predetermined end. The newly fueled Kampfgruppe surged out of Stavelot, engines roaring with the energy of American high-octane fuel. The taste of victory was sweet for the men, but for Peiper, the gasoline in the tanks felt less like a gift and more like a massive clock ticking down to zero. The delay at the dump, the critical hours spent siphoning the enemy's lifeblood, had utterly erased the element of surprise. The swift, terrifying push that characterized the first day of the offensive was gone. Now every road was contested. Every patch of high ground held an American forward observer. Every town became a stubborn bastion of defense, reinforced by newly arrived combat engineers and determined infantry ready to avenge their comrades. The spearhead, once a sharp needle, began to resemble a blunt fist, battering against increasingly stiff opposition. Peiper drove his men relentlessly toward the strategic bridges at the Meuse River, knowing that the only way to survive was to keep moving. Stagnation meant swift, deadly encirclement, but movement required more fuel, and the remaining American dumps were now being guarded with ferocious zeal or simply scorched before his arrival. As the column pushed deeper, the landscape itself turned hostile. The roads, initially manageable, became choked with burning wrecks and hastily erected roadblocks. The American counterfire, once sporadic and disorganized, became methodical, heavy, and constant. Peiper began to notice something else. The enemy was not just fighting back. They were actively pinning his force in place, pushing forces behind him. His radio channels crackled with desperate messages from his rear elements. The American 3rd Armored Division, having quickly regrouped, was closing the gaps Peiper had exploited. The entire German advance was rapidly becoming a salient, a deep, vulnerable pocket of men and machines that was being starved of support and ammunition. "Colonel, we cannot hold the bridge at Trois Ponts," a company commander reported, his voice tight with strain and exhaustion. "They are dug in, their artillery is massing, we are taking heavy losses trying to cross." Peiper slammed the microphone down. Trois Ponts, Werbemont, Staumont. Every name was a choke point, a small, stubborn piece of resistance that had magically appeared in the place of the weak, startled units he had steamrolled just 24 hours earlier. This was the American industrial machine responding. Slowly at first, then with crushing, inevitable momentum. He realized that his successful seizure of the fuel, which had felt like triumph, had only prolonged the agony. It had allowed his Kampfgruppe to drive deeper into a trap that was now springing shut. They were no longer the hunters, they were the quarry. As the last of the captured fuel was poured into the thirsty King Tigers, the initial elation of the men evaporated, replaced by a grim, sinking dread. They saw the fields of wreckage, not the promise of victory. They heard the constant, hammering sound of the American 105mm shells, not the cheering of liberated Belgians. They were surrounded by evidence of an enemy that was not merely defending, but outproducing them in real time. In the freezing dark, staring at the diminishing supply gauges, Peiper was no longer a bold SS commander. He was a man caught in a monstrous steel-and-fire vice. His realization at the fuel dump, the vision of America's limitless industrial might, was no longer an abstract fear. It was a tangible, icy reality that dictated every move, every loss, and the ultimate inescapable failure of his mission. How far can 50,000 gallons take a ghost? The order came down on December 23rd. Retreat. It was not a tactical withdrawal. It was a desperate, chaotic scrambling. Peiper's Kampfgruppe, once the sharp tip of the German spear, was now a beleaguered, cut-off pocket, surrounded by 2 American armored divisions near the desolate village of La Glise. The captured fuel, their salvation, was now a terrible burden. The tanks were full, but the roads were gone. Every escape route was blocked by enemy armor or infantry. Peiper had a choice: stand and fight until the last shell, or abandon the machinery and save the men. He chose the latter. The most difficult, most heart-wrenching order of his career was given: destroy the armor. Imagine the scene. The freezing Ardennes forest, lit by the ghastly, surreal flames of burning German war machines. Peiper's men, the proud panzer crewmen who had driven their tanks from the Eastern Front across half of Europe, were reduced to placing demolition charges on their own vehicles. The sound of high explosives ripping apart the engine blocks and gun barrels of dozens of tanks, including the irreplaceable King Tigers, was the official, deafening death knell of the entire offensive. And what of the captured fuel, the 50,000 gallons that had provided a few brief, glorious days of movement? It was now utterly useless. It could not be carried. It was abandoned. Left behind in the snow, a grim, ironic monument to an offensive that had lived and died by logistics. Peiper looked back at the carnage, the metallic scent of burnt oil mixing with the crisp, clean smell of pine. He was leaving behind 135 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, and utility vehicles, everything that made his unit a powerful fighting force. He and his 800 surviving men were now infantry, forced to slip away through the woods, carrying only their small arms and the crushing weight of failure. His original mission was to reach the Meuse River. He had reached La Glise, a mere 2/3 of the distance. He had seized a mountain of fuel, only to have it dissolve into an illusion of possibility. The entire offensive had hinged on a fragile logistical chain, and America's industrial might have broken that chain with passive, relentless force. It was not the superior tactics of the American generals that defeated him. It was the superior capacity of the American factories. It was the crushing knowledge that while his country was scraping the bottom of its last barrel of synthetic fuel, the enemy could afford to burn millions of gallons as a casual inconvenience. As Peiper and his men crossed back over the front line to German territory days later, exhausted and broken, the truth was indelible. His King Tigers, the pinnacle of German engineering, had been beaten by a simple, stenciled drum of American gasoline. The realization had come in a moment of captured glory. The war was not a battle between soldiers, but a marathon between production lines. And standing in that field of endless American barrels, Joachim Peiper had seen the full, terrifying face of the industrial giant they had dared to challenge. He knew with absolute certainty that the flame of the Third Reich had finally, irrevocably, begun to fade. Was Peiper right about the war being decided by factories, not fighting? Let me know what you think in the comments.